The light never really changed in that room. It was neither day nor night, just a constant gray hum, like time itself had gone missing. Jack Powers sat on the concrete floor of his cell in the administrative maximum prison in Florence, Colorado, staring at the small window cut high into the wall. Through that slit of glass, he could see a patch of sky, usually pale, sometimes the color of metal. It had been 12 years since he'd last touched a tree or seen the horizon stretch without fences. That morning, the silence pressed heavier than usual. The vents hissed. The steel door pulsed with distant footsteps. He leaned back against the wall, breathing in slow, counting each exhale as if it were a line on a calendar. The world beyond that door felt like rumor. Voices through a drainpipe, echoes through miles of cement. Yet inside that emptiness, a strange calm had begun to form, something that wasn't peace exactly, but wasn't fear either. It was the faint outline of freedom, the kind that starts in the mind when every other door is locked. Jack had been inside for nearly 3 decades now. Solitary had taken half of that. The calendar outside said 2011. For him it might as well have been one long day. Once, he'd been the man who could fix an engine blindfolded, who laughed too loud at bad jokes, who believed luck was a strategy. Back then, before the arrests, before the courtrooms in concrete, he carried a small tattoo on his forearm, a compass wrapped in barbed wire. It was supposed to remind him that no cage could tell him which way was north. But north had disappeared somewhere between the 2nd and the 7th year in isolation. Days bled together. Letters came rarely. His handwriting changed, his voice roughened from disuse. He learned to talk to the air because it was the only thing that answered. This was the moment when the story should have ended for him. Broken, forgotten, a number on a prison log. Yet something unexpected began to grow inside that cell. After years of silence, his mind started speaking again, but differently this time. Not through panic, but through words, sentences forming on scraps of paper, stories about regret, about memory, about what freedom could mean to a man who might never walk beyond the fence. That morning, with the gray light slicing the floor, he realized he was still alive. The idea was simple but shocking, like a sound breaking through static. He closed his eyes and felt his pulse in his wrists. The heartbeat was proof that something inside him refused to vanish. Outside the door, the guard's keys rattled. "Mail?" the man said, sliding an envelope through the slot. Jack hesitated before picking it up. The handwriting was familiar, his mother's. She had written every month, even when he couldn't write back. The letter said she was proud of him for holding on, that she believed the judge might finally hear his case again. She told him she'd keep a room ready, with sunlight and a small garden, if he ever made it home. Jack folded the letter carefully, smoothed it against his knee, and set it beside his bunk. It was the first time in years that hope didn't feel like a trick. The clang of doors echoed through the corridor, each metallic crash reminding him where he was. Yet instead of sinking, he stood and pressed his palm to the wall. The cool surface felt almost alive with the hum of the building. Other men breathing, dreaming, counting. He wasn't alone, not entirely. Somewhere down the tier, another prisoner shouted a name. Somewhere else, a laugh burst out, quick and reckless. Life, even here, refused to die quietly. Jack remembered the judge's voice from years ago, heavy and final. "You will be remanded to the custody of the Bureau of Prisons for a term." The words had slammed down like a gavel on his chest. But now, replaying them, he heard something else. A pause between custody and term, a space small enough to imagine change slipping through. He went back to his bunk, took the pencil stub from his Bible, and began to write. The first line came easily. "The freedom I feel in my heart and mind is stronger than the bars around me." He wasn't sure where the sentence came from, but once it landed on the page, more followed. The writing became his way out, not through the door, but through understanding. Each word rebuilt a piece of the man he used to be. He wrote about the trial, about the fear that led to choices he could never undo. He wrote about the years of anger, about watching men lose themselves to rage or silence. He wrote about how, at first, he'd sworn never to bend, and how slowly that vow turned into a different kind of strength, endurance. When his hand cramped, he switched hands. When the pencil wore to dust, he sharpened it with the edge of a food tray. Hours passed unnoticed. The air turned cooler. For the first time in months, he felt something close to purpose. By the time lights dimmed, He had filled both sides of a page. His handwriting was uneven, but every letter felt like oxygen. He lay back on the bunk, eyes on the faint rectangle of the window. Outside, the sky had gone deep blue, almost black. He could see a single star through the slit. Maybe it wasn't a star at all, just a plane or a reflection, but it was enough. He whispered a line from memory, something his stepfather used to say. The world doesn't end when you stop seeing it. It ends when you stop believing it's there. As he closed his eyes, that single point of light burned behind his eyelids. Tomorrow might bring news from the court, or nothing at all. But tonight, in this cell built to erase him, Jack Powers felt an unfamiliar sensation rising in his chest. It wasn't joy exactly, but it was close, something like the echo of sunlight. The guards would come by soon, flashlights sweeping through the small window, checking that he was still breathing. They'd see him lying there and think nothing had changed. They wouldn't know that inside his mind, the walls had started to crack, not from violence, but from words. And somewhere deep in the quiet heart of the Supermax, a man who had spent half his life alone whispered to himself, "I'm still here." Morning arrived without light, just the hum of the ventilation system rising through the walls. Jack woke before the guards made their first rounds. He dreamed of an open field, a sound of wind through trees so vivid it stayed with him long after he opened his eyes. For a few seconds he thought he could still smell grass. Then the gray of the cell pulled everything back into its quiet rhythm. There was a folded slip of paper under his door. Official mail. His hands shook a little as he unfolded it. Court date confirmed. Resentencing hearing scheduled in Federal District Court. He read the words 3 times, not sure whether to believe them. After decades of waiting, this single line of type looked almost fragile, as if one wrong breath could erase it. He sat on the edge of the bunk, listening to the building come alive. Doors clanged open one tier at a time. A guard shouted roll call. Somewhere, a man cursed at a broken radio. The ordinary noise of the place grounded him. He whispered, "It's real," and the sound of his own voice startled him. That day passed slowly. He kept the paper folded in his pocket, touching it now and then like a talisman. The thought of leaving, of walking anywhere without chains, made his chest tighten. Freedom was supposed to be simple, but to someone who hadn't used a front door in 30 years, it was an unknown language. A week later, they came for him before dawn. "Powers up. Pack what you need." He didn't have much. 2 books, a few letters, a stack of handwritten pages. He tucked them into a small box and waited while the cuffs clicked around his wrists. As they led him through the corridors, he caught sight of his reflection in a polished door. Older, leaner, the compass tattoo on his arm faded to a blur. He hadn't seen his own full face in years. The ride to the courthouse was silent except for the sound of the engine. Through the window, he watched the mountains slide by, pale blue under the morning sky. Every curve of the highway felt unreal, like watching the world from underwater. He wanted to memorize it. The motion, the color, the distance. At the courthouse, the light was almost blinding. He squinted as they guided him inside, past people in suits and polished shoes. He felt their eyes on him, but he kept his gaze forward. The judge was already on the bench when they brought him in. Jack remembered reading about him, a local man who'd worked his way up from public defender to federal judge. Something about that made Jack feel less like an exhibit and more like a man being seen. When the proceedings began, Jack listened to words that sounded both familiar and foreign: rehabilitation, time served, character transformation. His lawyer spoke of the essays he'd written, the progress he'd made. The prosecutor spoke of his past crimes and the escape attempt years ago. Jack stood when asked, hands clasped in front of him, and tried to speak evenly. "I don't ask for sympathy," he said. "Just the chance to live the rest of my life without walls." The judge studied him for a long time. The silence that followed was heavier than any door in ADX. Jack's pulse thudded in his ears. He thought of his mother's letter, the garden she promised, the star through the cell window. Finally, the judge nodded slowly. "Mr. Powers," he said, "the law requires that I consider both punishment and potential. You have served nearly 30 years. The record shows a man who has changed." He paused again. "The court will take this under advisement. A written decision will follow." And just like that, it was over. No verdict, no release, not yet. Jack was led back through the same corridors, cuffs cutting lightly into his wrists. Yet something in him had shifted. The world outside was no longer rumor. It was a possibility. Back in his cell that night, the gray light seemed softer. He placed the court notice and his mother's letter side by side on the table. The room felt smaller, but not as suffocating. He realized he'd stopped measuring time in years. Now he measured it in chances. That night, Jack couldn't sleep. He lay on the thin mattress staring at the ceiling, tracing invisible lines between the cracks in the paint. Each line reminded him of the routes he used to map out in his head, routes to nowhere. Now, for the first time, one of them might actually lead somewhere. He heard the shuffle of another inmate a few cells down. A cough. Then quiet again. Solitary was supposed to break a man's spirit, but it had done something stranger to Jack. It had slowed time until he could hear his own thoughts echo. It taught him patience, not the soft kind, but the kind forged from necessity. He thought of all the years he'd wasted fighting everyone and everything. Guards, judges, other inmates. Always angry, always defensive. That anger was armor, but it had kept him trapped long after the locks did. Somewhere in the silence, he learned to let go. A letter slid under his door the next morning. No stamp, just handwriting he didn't recognize. It read, "You don't know me, but your essays changed how I see this place. Keep writing. You're helping more people than you think." Jack read it twice, then folded it carefully and tucked it into his book. It was strange how a few words from someone unseen could reach through concrete and steel. He smiled for the first time in days, a small, tired smile, but real. The following weeks dragged by. Each day was a mirror of the last, except for the hope that hummed quietly beneath everything. The guards didn't talk about his case, but one of them, Martinez, slipped and said, heard the judge's decision might come soon. That was enough to keep Jack's heartbeat alive. He spent the days writing. Not about freedom or revenge, but about the small things he noticed. The way the light hit the floor at noon. The sound of rain hitting the roof like scattered gravel. The human moments that still existed in a place built to erase them. When the decision finally came, it wasn't dramatic. A guard opened his door and said, "Powers, you're being transferred." Jack blinked. Transferred where? Minimum security. The judge signed it this morning. He didn't speak for a full minute. Just stood there, feeling the weight of the words. Minimum security. It wasn't full freedom, but it was a step out of the tomb. The hallway seemed brighter as he walked out, carrying his small box of possessions. The bus ride to the new facility felt like being reborn. The air smelled different. Cleaner, open. He watched towns roll by, people walking dogs, kids crossing streets, simple things he used to take for granted. At the new prison, there were no solid steel doors, no blinding fluorescent lights. He could walk outside in a small yard for an hour. The first time he stepped into the sun, it hit him like a wave. He closed his eyes and stood there, breathing deep, feeling the heat soak into his skin. He hadn't felt real sunlight in over 20 years. Later that day, a counselor asked him, "What's the first thing you'll do if you ever get full parole?" Jack thought for a long moment, then said quietly, "Find a place where the sky doesn't end." That night, he sat by the window of his new cell, looking out at the faint outline of trees beyond the fence. Somewhere out there was his mother's garden, maybe long gone, maybe still blooming. For the first time, he didn't feel trapped by the walls. He felt anchored by his own heart, by the freedom he'd built in his mind long before the system ever offered it. The gates slid open with a heavy groan, and for the first time in decades, Jack Powers stepped into a place that didn't hum with constant dread. The yard of the minimum security prison looked almost unreal. Patches of grass, men walking freely in groups, laughter that didn't sound forced. He stood there for a long second, breathing it in. The air tasted different. Not clean, not free, but alive. A guard nudged him forward. "Welcome to your new reality, Powers. Don't get lost." The comment stuck with him all day. Don't get lost. Because that was exactly how it felt, like waking from a coma in a world that had kept moving without you. His new cell was small, but not suffocating. It had a narrow window that opened, letting in the smell of rain from the fields beyond the fence. The walls weren't pure concrete. There was paint, faded but still there. The first night, Jack didn't sleep, not because of noise or fear, but because the silence was different. It wasn't heavy. It was wide. The next morning, he joined the line for breakfast. A man in his 50s with a scruffy beard nodded at him. "You're the guy from Florence, right? ADX. Jack hesitated, then nodded. The man grinned. Heard you wrote that piece. The freedom I feel in my heart and mind. Powerful stuff, man. Jack felt his throat tighten. Yeah, that was me. Respect, the man said, patting his shoulder. You kept a lot of us sane. You know that? It was strange, being seen not as a monster or a case number, but as a voice. The essays he wrote in isolation had traveled farther than he ever could. Later that day, Jack started working in the prison garden. It was small, fenced, and mostly dirt, but to him, it was paradise. He knelt in the soil and pressed his fingers into it, feeling the earth for the first time in 30 years. The texture, the smell, it all hit him like a memory. He could almost hear his mother humming in her garden back home. Every afternoon, when the sky turned amber, he'd sit on a wooden bench and watch the sun dip behind the fence. It was the same sun he'd seen through bars for years, but now it burned differently. It carried warmth instead of mockery. Still, there were moments when fear crept in. Freedom, even partial, scared him. What if he couldn't survive outside? What if he'd forgotten how to live without rules and walls? One evening, during a counseling session, he admitted it. I'm afraid of the world. The counselor, a calm woman with silver hair, nodded. That's normal. Solitary confinement rewires the brain. But you've already done the hardest part. You learn to exist in your own mind. The next step is learning to exist with others. Jack thought about that all night. For decades, his voice had been the only one he trusted. Now he was surrounded by people again. People who laughed, argued, dreamed. It was overwhelming, but in a way, it was healing. Weeks passed. He began helping new inmates learn to read. The prison library became his second home. Books were still his escape, but now they were bridges, connecting him to others. One afternoon, he received another letter. This one was from a university professor. We've read your essays in our criminal justice seminar. You've started a conversation we should have had years ago. When you're free, I hope you'll visit our class. He read it 3 times, his hands trembling slightly. For the first time, he saw a future that wasn't shaped by bars or bulletproof glass. Maybe he could teach. Maybe he could help others see what isolation really does to the human soul. That night, under the soft hum of the prison lights, Jack whispered to himself, I'm not who I was. And he meant it. He looked out through the window, no longer searching for freedom, but simply watching the light. It spilled across the yard like forgiveness. The letter about parole came on a cold morning in early spring. Jack had just finished watering the garden when the warden's assistant called his name. The envelope was thick, government letterhead, official and final. His hands shook as he opened it. Your request for parole has been granted, effective June 14th. He read the line twice, unable to breathe. The page blurred. For so long, freedom had been something abstract, a word, not a possibility. Now it was real, printed in black ink. That night, he couldn't eat. He lay on his bunk, staring out the window at the dark sky. The stars looked close, almost reachable. But the closer they looked, the farther away he felt from everything else. When release day came, the world greeted him with noise. So much noise. Car engines, voices, the low hum of wind through open space. He stepped off the bus in Denver wearing the same brown clothes he'd had for years. The officer beside him handed him a small envelope. Your belongings. Good luck, Powers. Inside were a few dollars, an ID card, and a folded letter. The one from his mother, sent decades ago and returned unopened after she passed. He stood on the curb, cars rushing past, sunlight spilling across the city. For a long time, he didn't move. The sky above him was enormous, terrifyingly open. A volunteer from a re-entry program arrived, a woman named Lisa with a calm smile. She drove him to a halfway house, explaining the process. He nodded quietly, not saying much. Everything outside the car window felt unreal, the colors too bright, the air too sharp. When they stopped at a red light, he saw a young couple holding hands on the sidewalk. The simple act made his chest ache. 30 years gone. 30 years without a touch that wasn't meant to restrain. At the halfway house, his new room was small but his own. He touched the walls, the bed, the small desk, ordinary things that now felt sacred. That night, he sat by the window and watched the city lights. No guards, no curfew, no keys clanging in the hall. But the silence inside him was louder than ever. He woke up at 3 a.m. drenched in sweat. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. The ceiling looked different, too open. He felt exposed. His chest tightened, his breathing quickened. It took a full minute before he realized, "You're not an ADX anymore." He pressed his palms together, trying to steady himself. Freedom is supposed to feel light, he thought. So why does it weigh so much? The next morning, Lisa picked him up for his first day at a community center, part of his parole conditions. He was to help maintain the garden there, teach others how to care for plants. When he arrived, a group of volunteers greeted him warmly. One of them, a tattooed veteran named Marcus, smiled wide. "You're Jack, right? Man, I read your essay years ago. You got me through my own time in the hole." Jack looked up, stunned. "You were in solitary?" Marcus nodded. "Yeah, different state, same hell. But your words, they made me believe there was still something left inside." Jack didn't know what to say. For so long, he'd written from darkness, never knowing if anyone would understand. Now, standing there in the sunlight, he realized those words had traveled far beyond his cell. He spent hours teaching people how to plant tomatoes, prune stems, and feel the soil. The dirt under his nails reminded him of his first day in the prison garden. Life had come full circle, but this time, he wasn't just surviving it. He was sharing it. Weeks turned into months. He began speaking at schools and rehabilitation programs, always careful, always humble. When asked about his past, he didn't glorify it. He spoke about silence, how it can crush or cleanse a man depending on how he faces it. And one evening, as he walked home, the sky broke open in a summer storm. Thunder rolled, rain poured down, and for a moment, he just stood there in the street, head tilted up, water streaming down his face. No bars, no walls, just rain. He laughed softly, almost disbelieving. After all the years locked away, this was freedom, messy, unpredictable, loud, and utterly alive. He walked the rest of the way home soaked, his shoes squeaking, his heart lighter than it had been in decades. That night, he wrote in his notebook, "Freedom isn't the absence of walls. It's learning to breathe, even when the world feels too big." And with that, Jack Powers finally slept through the night. The story of Jack Powers isn't one about prisons and punishment. It's about what happens when the world forgets a man, and he learns to remember himself. From the concrete silence of ADX Florence to the open air of Denver's streets, Jack walked a road that most of us will never see. He lost nearly everything: time, family, freedom, but somehow found something greater inside himself. He learned that freedom doesn't start at the prison gate. It starts in the mind, in the heart, in that quiet decision to keep breathing, even when every wall around you says stop. Today, Jack lives a small life. No fame, no headlines, no spotlight. But when he speaks, people listen. His words remind us that redemption isn't a miracle, it's a choice. One that begins the moment a person stops running from who they were and starts becoming who they were meant to be. So when the lights fade and the voices quiet, remember this. Some walls are made of concrete, but the hardest ones to break are the ones we build inside ourselves. This was Voices from Solitary, the freedom I feel in my heart and mind. If this story moved you, share it, because somewhere out there, another voice is still waiting to be heard.